Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Well, today I've got a really special guest. That's Paul Motor from the Wasp Files, who's been doing a deep dive into Port Arthur for a number of years now. But his new series has really shone a light and brought attention to this and racked up millions of views. So today, obviously, viewer discretion is advised, and we'll be discussing some pretty graphic content. But I wanted this podcast to try and serve as a good overview of the events leading up to it, what actually happened that day, and the fallout from afterwards. So, welcome to the show, Paul.
Welcome, thank you.
For those that haven't looked into this before, it's one of those things where, as you start to look into it, it becomes more and more obvious that the official story is very different to what unfolded that day. But what started you on your journey wanting to research this?
I started way back in 2016. I'm a writer and filmmaker by trade. And back then, my intention was I was shopping around for an idea for an independent feature film and thought maybe should do something on the Port Arthur Massacre, which no one had ever touched since 1996. So I began researching the crime, the tragedy. At the time, all I knew was what everybody else knew was that Martin Bryant had gone down there with high-powered semi-automatic rifles and shot up Port Arthur and killed 35 men, women, and children and injured 23 others. So I began my research, and the deeper I dug, I just came up with a lot of questions, more questions than answers, and thought this just doesn't add up. And I dug deeper than most, not just what I read online, but I wanted to speak firsthand to the people that were directly involved. So I spoke to the police, first responders, survivors, two of whom are good friends now, people that knew Martin Bryant, grew up with him, went to
Yeah.
prison with him. And after 9 exhaustive years, found myself still trying to make the film, which I intend to do, with a lot of closed doors in my face. But yeah, 9 years later, decided to do the Wasp Files to, I guess, educate people on what they don't know about Port Arthur.
Yeah, so I guess before we get into the timeline of the events and how it all played out, I think for me, and I want to get your opinion on this, is just kind of the top five things for people that are watching this that haven't looked into it at all, that maybe have only ever heard the official narrative. For me, I think the top five things that stand out are that only 2 out of the 200 witness testimonies positively identified Martin Bryant as the shooter at Port Arthur. Some of those survivors, like Wendy Skur and Jim Laycock and others, that also said that knew Martin Bryant, that said it wasn't him that they saw. Then we've got that morgue truck that was ordered before and sold shortly after, the only one in Australia, let alone happening to be in Hobart, Tasmania that day. One of the other ones that I think was really fascinating, you dug up in a recent episode, was that UN document about the gun laws that they wanted Australia to pass and the role of the kind of globalists that people are more familiar with these days. I think that was a big revelation, as well as the conferences that were in Hobart that day, the surgeons conference and the media conference and that type of thing. So would you agree that those are, maybe for people that haven't looked into this, the top five things, or what are your things that stand out the most?
Where do I start? Look, all I can say is the magnitude of the investigation into this crime and tragedy, the breadth and scale of it is astounding. So it's very hard just to pinpoint down. I could go through and list. I do advise everyone to go on the Wasp Files, which is on YouTube, where I've done quite a number of filmed podcasts exploring all these individual and collective overview aspects of the Port Arthur massacre. But I guess some of the biggest ones for me are that this was the biggest crime, the biggest mass shooting by a lone gunman in the world at the time, or one of. And by state law, we should have mandated a coronial inquest, but we didn't have that. That was quashed by the Premier at the time in Tasmania and by our Prime Minister, John Howard. So the enormity of this crime somehow did not warrant a coronial inquest, whereas other mass shootings, such as the Lint Cafe siege in Sydney, the Hoddle Street shootings, they all mandated coronial inquests. We also didn't have an open trial. So no open trial for the convicted perpetrator, Martin Bryant. So he was never cross-examined. We never had the witnesses brought forward to give their testimony and for them to be cross-examined. Never had any of the hard evidence that was collected, the forensics, the DNA, the fingerprints. presented. They've never seen the light of day. They've never seen a court of law. We never had a royal commission. So that information, the hard evidence, if you want to call it that, that would comprehensively prove 100% beyond reasonable doubt in a court of law the innocence or guilt of the party involved, has been locked down by the authorities, initially by the Hobart Supreme Court in 1996 for 30 years, was meant to expire next year. And then I found out that the Tasmanian Archives Heritage Office has digitised all of the records and evidence and information documents with Port Arthur and sealed them under the highest restrictive category, E75, Chief Police Commissioner's eyes only, for a further 75 years, which means you, me, and everyone else will be dead by the time that that information will be released, if ever. So the warning flags for me was there's no access to the information. There's the witnesses haven't given their statements, particularly those that contradicted the mainstream story. People like Graham Collier, Wendy Skua, Jim Laycock, Roger Lana never had their say in court. So they've locked the information away. They've locked Martin Bryan away. No one can get to see him. And that raises a real red flag for me.
As they've done with other similar global events, with squashing the files for 75 years and not letting the public view them as well. So, but why don't we paint a picture of the landscape at the time about gun laws? And there was a push for multiple years to try and disarm Australians. And there was a couple of senators that had those quotes. It's going to take a massacre on Tasmanian soil to get these laws through and that type of thing. But why don't you give people a bit of an overview of what that backdrop was leading up to the events in '96?
Yeah, a little bit of perspective. Prior to 1996, the Port Arthur Massacre, homicide gun deaths were on the decline. They weren't on the increase. We did have two mass shootings in Victoria in 1987, the Hoddle Street shooting and the Queen Street shooting. And the Premier at the time, John Cain, then implemented a ban on high-powered semi-automatic rifles, which I guess you could say was a precedent example of how you can restrict firearm ownership due to gun crime. So basically, there was a requirement, even though states like Queensland and Tasmania were known to have looser gun laws. The federal government, as early as 1991, was trying to draft a nationwide federal uniform gun law legislation. But the states were balking. So there was a lot of conflict about the conditions of having a nationwide uniform gun law requirement put in place. So yes, the New South Wales Premier at the time, Barry Unsworth, was famous for storming out of the meeting saying there'll never be uniform gun laws in Australia until there's a massacre in Tasmania. Lo and behold, sometime later there was.
And just on that quickly, Paul, it was Tasmania and South Australia that were the two states that were pushing back the hardest for some of these reforms. Is that true?
I believe it was Queensland and Tasmania.
Okay.
So South Australia, all of the states had their own ideas on what their state gun laws should be. And I guess even though, contrary to popular belief, even though they had the loose laws, Tasmania did have the 1991 gun legislation, which required you to have a license and to be assessed as a fit and proper person. So that was in place. It had replaced the laws of 1937, I believe. So interestingly enough, Martin Bryant did not have a gun license. And there is a lot of very serious questions about where the firearms came from, the origins of those guns, how they made their way down to Tasmania and were used at the Port Arthur Massacre. But Martin Bryant did not have a gun licence, which in essence makes him a criminal.
Other things that happened leading up to that day, before we get to the sequence of events and the timeline from the actual day itself, the morgue truck that we mentioned. So there was some people say it held 20 bodies, some people say it might have held 30 bodies, but a large custom-made morgue truck and was in Tasmania, in Hobart, and it arrived before the massacre and was sold after the massacre. But that is one of those big red flag standout ones for me. What can you tell us about that?
It's one of many coincidences. Now, being of a scientific mind, and I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist or an activist or a crusader, you just have to consider the notion that when you have one or two coincidences associated with an event, you can say, okay, they're coincidences. When you have a multitude, then you have what they call synchronicity, which is a very strong indication that all of those coincidences, once they lined up, suggest an alternative determination or outcome. So the infamous morgue truck, which most people know about, was the Tasmania, which had very few deaths per year at the time. The state had commissioned the construction of a 22-person refrigerated morgue truck, which was a Chevrolet with a big refrigerated container on the back, specifically for the purpose of being able to deliver that many cadavers to the coroner's court. At the time, there was incredulity about why Tasmania needed such a big truck, because Victoria and New South Wales had far higher death rates and they didn't have a truck. So you would imagine, once Port Arthur had exploded and there was a requirement, lo and behold, they were very fortuitously provided with this refrigerated morgue truck to be able to get the victims in a state to where they could be examined. And then you would think, okay, great, let's hang on to that because it's very valuable. But the truck was sold by an ex-Special Operations Group police officer by the name of Chris Wright, who advertised the truck for sale in the local paper as the truck that was used at the Port Arthur Massacre and could even be used in a movie reenactment. So the truck was dismantled and sold and, well, presumably sold or disappeared.
Yeah.
But that is just one. There were so many coincidences that occurred that basically indicated a possible foreknowledge of a planned event. I could go through them if you wish.
Yeah, keep going if you want to before the events leading up to it. But was another one of those the morgue itself actually had upgrades for the leading up to this?
Yeah, that was the Nelson brothers in Melbourne had been congratulated by a member of Parliament, and at the time he was also one of the members of the coroner's court, and his name was Stephen Parry, and he had congratulated the Nelson brothers, which was a funeral service in Melbourne, for the construction of some refrigerated units to store bodies. And the wording that he used was in time ready for the incident, which could have just been a slip of the tongue or his wording perhaps, but it was picked up upon because people said, hang on, what do you mean by having these refrigerated units ready for the incident? So he was given a show cause notice and asked to clarify that statement. And my understanding is there hasn't been any clarification. Some of the other glaring coincidences were that just prior to the Port Arthur massacre, the Hobart Hospital had implemented a Code Brown, which was a protocol for the hospital to be able to go into immediate action to deal with an influx of mass trauma patients. They just put that in place. There was also a convention that was held down in Hobart for trauma surgeons from all over Australia, dealing specifically with the means and requirements and their abilities to deal with mass trauma casualty events. So it was very lucky that we had some trauma surgeons from all over the world that had been trained in that field on hand, ready to deal with the victims that were brought in from Port Arthur. There was also a convention of journalists from all over the world. There was something like 700 journalists, and they were in Hobart at the time. So once the news had burst open upon the scene about the massacre, these reporters were bussed in their droves and in some cases escorted around the crime scenes. Yeah. So the media coverage was there on hand immediately to be able to cover the event. These are just some of the coincidences. There are many of them.
There was special operations, SACPAV took place in Hobart a few weeks before this as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. A few months. SACPAV stands for the Standing Advisory Committee on the Prevention Against Violence, which in essence is counter-terrorism exercises. So in the months leading up to Port Arthur, we had specialist tactical police working in collaboration with members of the Australian Defence Force, carrying out counter-terrorism exercises on the Tasman Peninsula. Yeah. This also coincidentally occurred at the same time that we had the London bombings, and also during the New Zealand Christchurch massacre. Yes. There were operations carried out, counter-terrorism operations, literally on the go, just prior to and during those events. So, yes, you had tactical police and support members of the Australian Defence Force on hand and around the Tasman Peninsula at the time.
Yeah, we also saw that on 9/11 on the same day when they had those tactical for the Air Force, so they couldn't get called in, and we'll get to maybe some similarities in this on the day. The other one I want to ask you about leading up to it was Martin had started dating Petra Wilmot a few months before this. What are your thoughts on her and her involvement and at all?
Look, I've discussed the notion, as many have, that she may have been a handler. By all accounts, she was an intelligent woman. She was quite young, though. She was 20 years old when she was dating Martin. And they'd been dating for approximately 3 months before the massacre and were in love. So it sort of flies in the face of some of the films like Nitram that was produced, which suggested that Martin was just this lonely, isolated, angry person on his own. He had a relationship with Helen Harvey prior to her death, but he also had, Petra Wilmot as his girlfriend. I did speak to a gentleman that had met Martin Bryant in a cafeteria, and he was struck by the fact that it was a hot day and Martin was wearing a 3-piece white suit. And he engaged him in conversation. He said it wasn't an easy conversation to have. And they were sort of talking away. And then he said a young dark-haired woman came over, sat down next to Martin and just looked at him, just gave him a look. And Martin took one look at her, and that was it. The conversation was over. There were no more words spoken, and they got up and left. Mm. And he said to me, it just seemed to me that she gave him a look saying, this conversation is over. I then showed him a photograph of Petra Wilmot, and he said, yes, that was the lady. I'll call that gentleman Bruce. So she was a bit of a mysterious figure. By all accounts, just a young girl. She'd also stated when asked by Ray Martin why she dated him, and she replied, because he was gentle and kind and looked after me. Yeah. She also had no knowledge, supposedly, that he owned firearms, though she did mention that he would make comments about firearms and point his finger and, make gun shooting, gestures with his hands, which many people do. She is very, very hard to track down, probably justifiably. She may have changed her name. I would dearly love to talk to her. I've read some interesting statements from her that she presented to the police, and they have some very interesting things to say that suggested there were things going on behind the scene. These are important. One of them was that apparently there was an individual that Martin was afraid to answer the phone for. This person was known as Tiger, and Martin didn't want to answer the phone because he was frightened of this Tiger, though she never knew who this person was. Tiger is a nickname for ex-Special Operations Group Michael Dyson, who some have accused of being one of the people involved in the Port Arthur massacre. She also stated that she was shown a photograph of Martin talking to a long-haired, blonde-haired individual outside a photo store and asked if she knew who that individual was. And she replied that she didn't know who that person was, but that they looked kind of similar, except the other gentleman had the beginnings of a beard. Yeah. So her statements just present some odd questions. Just finally on that, she was going to come over to see Martin the night before the shooting and called him up, and he said, no, you can't come over because I'm waiting for a call from Melbourne. And she said, what's this in relation to? And he said, it's something to do with a German television. the purchase of a German television. Following on from that, he then said, hey, you can come over. So they spent the night together. They went out dancing at the local nightclub, came home, made love, showered together, got up in the morning and separated. This is the night before the massacre.
Yeah.
But he was apparently waiting on some call from Melbourne that may have precluded her visitation.
And Martin had, I believe, trips to the UK. And is there any connection there with the Tavistock Institute or, that side of things? I think you've touched on the MK Ultra. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
The connection between Tavistock is a very tenuous one. However, there is a connection. A very renowned psychiatrist who was one of the founding associates of the Tavistock Institute, which, for people who don't know, was in essence a social engineering institution that had been created in the 1940s in the UK following World War II. And in essence, it was dealing with the effects of mass trauma on the civilian population, the effects of war, dealing with soldiers that had PTSD. And then later on, over the decades, Tavistock had basically employed a renowned cadre of very, very well-regarded psychiatrists who had done some experimentations in deep sleep hypnosis and, in essence, mind control. One of those was Dr. Rhys Rawlings. Dr. Cunningham Dax was a renowned psychiatrist who moved from the UK to Tasmania in 1969, ostensibly to continue his research into some of the psychological experimentations that the Tavistock Institute was carrying out, and his own research as well. He was very well regarded for pioneering a restructure of the mental health system in Australia. So he's very well rewarded for that. But he did evaluate Martin Bryant when Martin Bryant was 16 in 1984. There's very little records. They've all been destroyed in relation to the evaluation of Martin by Dr. Cunningham Dax. There was some reports by his mother that he said, look, he's of low IQ and has some difficulties on his social interactions with people, and suggested that there wasn't much hope for him that he would go on some form of disability benefit. And Martin's mother, Carleen, had responded, is this to do with his schizophrenia? Because there was some question about whether or not Martin had schizophrenia. And Dr. Dax had replied, it's not as simple as that. That's about the extent to what we have. We do know that Tavistock has been, there are a lot of claims that the Tavistock Institute had been involved in some very nefarious activities. MK Ultra, which is the factual experimentation literally on mind control that was initiated and carried out by the CIA in the 1960s, was of factual existence. It was shut down in Congress after it came to light that they were doing very unethical and unlawful experimentation involving drugs and deprivation and abuse on civilians. The CIA did bring MK Ultra to Australian shores in the 1960s with Professor Martin Orne, who had come out to do a conference in Sydney. And they were doing experiments and talking about how people could be, in essence, controlled or hypnotized to carry out acts of antisocial behavior up to and including attempted murder. Yeah. This information is freely available. As I said, it's a very deep dive into this whole thing, but there is a tenuous link between Martin Bryant, Dr. Cunningham Dax, the Tavistock Institute, and the experiments that were carried out on mind control and manipulation of the population.
Yeah. Let's fast forward then to the day that this all unfolded. So what time does this start and the reports of the first shots being heard and that diversion where the police were called out to a drug bust to try and take the local police away from where events were about to unfold, and talk us through that, how it all started?
The first phone call that was made to police indicating that there was a shooting at the Port Arthur historic site was made by Wendy Skua, who was a Port Arthur historic employee. This was made at 1:32. Prior to then, the only two police officers close to the Port Arthur site were lured away with a phone call with a report that there were drugs that were found across the other side of the island at the saltwater coal mines. These two officers then left the station, drove 30 minutes away to that site to discover jars of soap powder. While they were over there, of course, the shooting then took place at the Port Arthur historic site. Now, that's quite clever if it was Martin Bryant that had orchestrated that, because, Martin Bryant had an IQ of 66, supposedly making the equivalent of an 11-year-old child. So that's pretty clever to lure the only two police officers away. Their job was to close the swing bridge across to the mainland. So there was no police on hand to really monitor what was going on. Once the shooting had taken place, it was something like 6 hours before the police, who had converged en masse, even from the mainland. Special Operations Group police was sent from New South Wales and Victoria. And rather than hit the site straight away, they were kept at Turana, which is just like a sort of a camping area, and they had a barbecue there. And it wasn't until the early evening of that same day that they converged in force on the Port Arthur historic site. The first police that were on site arrived by helicopter. They were two unarmed constables, and they were greeted with hundreds of tourists who were in a panic station, employees such as Wendy Scoor that were performing triage on the victims in the cafe, covered in blood and just screaming for help, saying, where are the authorities? Where are the ambulances?
Yeah.
So it was, according to the papers that were drafted in relation to the incident, it was considered too dangerous for the police to enter the Port Arthur historic site straight away, even though we had Special Operations Group police on hand.
If we just rewind a bit, Paul, was there reports of some witnesses saying they heard shots as early as like 10:30 in the morning when Martin was seen at a petrol station having a coffee nearby? How does that tie into it all?
Yeah, prior to the actual assault at the Port Arthur historic site, there was a bed and breakfast known as Seascape Cottage. It later factored in as the siege location once the shooter had left the Port Arthur historic site. The two elderly owners of that cottage, David and Sally Martin, were discovered in the burnt remains of the cottage once it had been set alight, and they had been shot and bludgeoned. Witnesses had stated early in the morning, neighbours to the Seascape Cottage, that they heard a number of rifle shots coming from the vicinity of the Seascape Cottage at between 10:30 and 11 a.m. on the morning of the 28th of April, 1996. Martin Bryant had given testimony, and there were witness statements that a person matching his description had basically travelled down from Newtown, where he lived at his house at 30 Clare Street, and had stopped along the way for various reasons, one of which was to buy a cup of coffee, and the other was supposedly to engage other people in conversation, to buy a bottle of tomato sauce at a supermarket. So there was a trail of breadcrumbs, if you like, that seemed to indicate that Martin Bryant, or someone that looked like him, had travelled down and had interactions with people. But the timeline suggests that Martin Bryant was 58 kilometres away when the shots were recorded happening at the Seascape Cottage, where the couple were presumably murdered.
Yeah.
I will be doing episodes on the timeline, but once again, there are some oddities that don't add up, and descriptions of what, people who knew Martin Bryant, who engaged him prior to Port Arthur, and their statements were initially they didn't recognise that person as being Martin Bryant, even though they'd known them.
Yeah.
All of this, of course, should have come out in court, but didn't.
Now, Martin's car was a yellow Volvo, but there was actually two yellow Volvos you mentioned in a recent episode, both with surfboards on top, but I think one had the cover on it and the other one didn't. So how does that tie into it? And when he got to the car park, trying to park that, and where does it go from there? Yeah.
I'm not sure about both of the yellow Volvos having surfboards on the roof. I have heard the reports that that was the case. There was definitely a witness statement that a yellow Volvo was driven onto the Port Arthur historic site by two females, and that somebody in the immediate aftermath of the shooting had said, "Hey, look, you better not drive that car because the police might mistake you for being the shooter who had been witnessed driving off in the distinctive yellow Volvo with the surfboard, which Martin allegedly owned, out of the Port Arthur historic site." So there were two yellow Volvos. There was also a witness description from Jai Nichols, who was hitchhiking, in essence, along on his way to the Port Arthur historic site. And he had statements about yellow Volvos travelling in different directions with a time difference between them. There was also witness statements from two tourists who'd pulled up at the Seascape Cottage in the morning, wanting to, see if they could, evaluate it for being a place to stay. It was a very popular bed and breakfast, and that there was a yellow Volvo with the doors open, parked in the driveway. There was an altercation with a blonde-haired male who'd come out in a sort of a frenzied state, and they said they wanted to go inside Seascape Cottage and have a look, and he said, "No, my girlfriend's sleeping inside. I suggest you go away." And something about his demeanour made them turn tail and head out. But there definitely was two yellow Volvos on the location, which is not unusual. It's just another vehicle. There could, of course, be two yellow Volvos, but in the context of examining Port Arthur, it has some bearing.
So when the yellow Volvo arrived and tried to park near the ferry, is this part of the importance as well, whereas the ferry had just changed the times that it had left because of daylight savings, I think it was? And how does that tie into the timeline and that as well?
This is very important. Assistant Commissioner Lupo Prins had given a report to the Hobart Mercury, and there were indications that the initial target for the shooter was not the Broad Arrow Cafe, but the Bundina ferry that would take tourists across to the Isle of the Dead. The Isle of the Dead was a little island just off the mainland with historical grave sites. That day, there was apparently 80 US tourists that were scheduled to take that ferry across to the Isle of the Dead. The shooter had driven onto the Port Arthur historic site and tried to park down near the water's edge where the jetty is that leads to the Bundina ferry to the Isle of the Dead. But they had unpredictably perhaps changed the schedule for the ferry, and it had left 30 minutes earlier. So the reports were that the shooter had an altercation with the traffic manager and security manager on the site, Ian Kingston, about wanting to get onto the ferry and parking down near the water's edge. He was told, "No, you can't park here. We need this place for the buses." The shooter had then exited the Volvo, which was left at the water's edge, made their way into the gift shop and the adjacent Broad Arrow Cafe, and that's when the actual shooting took place in there. There was an uninteresting report from one of the patrons of the cafe, a man by the name of Anthony Nightingale, who, when the shooter got to their feet and began opening fire on the patrons in the cafe, he had yelled out, "No, no, not here," before being shot down. It was an unusual thing to say, perhaps. So the implication was that the initial target was the ferry, but there'd been a change in operation because the ferry had left. So the shooter had improvised and decided to shoot up the cafe, and that possibly, if you consider the notion that there may have been plants or spotters in there whose job it was to identify the shooter getting onto the ferry. And then when that didn't occur, they became inadvertent victims.
Yeah. So when the shooting began, as you say, it was around 1:30. Wendy Skur was the one that first called it in, but that first, some people say 90 seconds, some people say 5 minutes. And a lot of those were headshots, and the emergency fire door was nailed shut or locked shut somehow. And that's where the most of the people died in the Broad Arrow Cafe there. So walk us through that kind of timeline and how you think that played out to the best of your knowledge.
Once again, there's a disparity. The police prosecutor, um, Damien Bugg, had reported that the shooting that took place within the confines of the Broad Arrow Cafe, which was a crowded little cafe to serve the patrons on the day, took place within 90 seconds. Some of the witnesses, like Sarah Vanderpeer, had disputed that timing by saying that it was more like between 3 to 5 minutes. Indications were that the shooting did take place uh, in excess of 90 seconds. In a very short amount of time, however, 20 people lost their lives in the Broad Arrow Cafe alone. 6 of those lost their lives because they were trying to escape through a fire exit door that had been nailed shut. So there were, in essence, only really 3 exits to the Broad Arrow Cafe. There was the fire exit door, which was nailed shut. There was the main entrance, and then there was the entrance to the kitchen. There was also an entrance out onto the balcony. But the authorities had reported that the door lock itself on the fire exit door was inoperable or faulty. That was reported by Wendy Skur, who was the Port Arthur Historic Site employee, to be a cover-up, because the door, she had confirmed from a friend of hers whose husband had been instructed to nail the door shut to prevent people stealing from the gift shop. As a result, 6 people lost their lives crowded around that door, were shot down. Yes, a lot of the killings were headshots. It was very close ranges, to be fair. Ranges anywhere from 1 to 2 meters to contact, and the shooter did not spray or pray. They were witnessed as being very calm, very methodical, very proficient with the use of the firearm. One of the survivors, Neville Quinn, had stated that he was the best trained army man I've ever seen. His stance was unbelievable. Conversely, Martin Bryan's proficiency with firearms was not that way. He certainly wasn't trained, and by all reports, he was quite uncoordinated. But yeah, a lot of people lost their lives very quickly, and then the shooting took place outside the cafeteria, in the grounds around the buses, and continuing on the exit road out of the Port Arthur Historic Site to the toll booth.
Yeah, before we pick it up again there, a lot of those witnesses said that the shooter was right-handed and Martin was known to be a left-handed shooter. Is that the other big one?
That's correct. Most of the witnesses stated that the majority of the shooting, though not all of it, was undertaken by the shooter, in essence, shooting from the hip,
yeah,
rather than from the shoulder, from their right hand, whereas Martin was known to be a left-handed shooter, and he did demonstrate this in a video interview that he undertook with Inspectors Warren and Payne, that he shot from the left. The rifle that was used, which was a Colt SP1, sort of an AR-15 equivalent, a civilian rifle, had a scope on the carry handle along the top. So it would have been difficult to, acquire a target from the hip. You wouldn't be able to look through the scope. But if you brought the rifle to your shoulder, you would be able to sight down the telescopic sight. It is, by all reports, an astounding feat for any one man to have accomplished, even in the close confines of the Broad Arrow Cafe and in the other circumstances of the shooting. 35 men, women, and children taken in a very short amount of time. And there was quite a significant degree of accuracy, and by all reports, a very highly trained individual.
Yeah, so now that the initial shootings happened at the cafe, you said he now moves to the toll booth, and walk us through what happens next. I think there's a bizarre incident with maybe a black van and another vehicle with other people in it where there was some communication, maybe?
One of the other odd occurrences that, once again, it just needs a determination, an investigation to evaluate what had taken place, was that the shooter had jumped back into the yellow Volvo, which was parked near the water's edge, and had driven out of the historic site. Along the way, they stopped and murdered a young mother and her two young children of 6 and 3, even chasing one of the children around the tree and killing them, which was horrific. And this murder had occurred just before the toll booth, which was in essence the entrance to the Port Arthur historic site. The Cheok family had driven up to the entrance to the toll booth because they were intending to enter the site, and were met with an unusual scenario where both lanes, incoming and outgoing, leading to Port Arthur, were blocked by vehicles. The outgoing lane was blocked by Martin Bryant's yellow Volvo with the surfboard on the top, and the incoming lane was blocked by a bronze BMW sedan. The bronze BMW sedan had 4 occupants, 2 women and 2 men. However, 2 of those individuals were witnessed seated in the front seat and rear seat of Martin Bryant's yellow Volvo with the gunman, having a conversation. This was not at gunpoint, but basically the people that had pulled up saw that there was a conversation that was taking place in the yellow Volvo, and 2 other people seated in the BMW that was blocking the incoming lane. At one point, Robert Salzman exited from the rear passenger seat of the yellow Volvo and just stood there. The gunman then exited and they had a conversation. It became argumentative. At this point, there was no firearm in view. The gunman then walked around to the rear of the yellow Volvo and retrieved a firearm and shot Robert Salzman dead. He then went around to the front of the yellow Volvo, dragged out Helene Salzman and executed her. The other male occupant of the BMW then exited the BMW and walked over to where that shooting had occurred, and then he was shot down as well. And the gunman then dragged the female out of the front seat of the BMW and shot her as well. So 4 people were killed. The gunman then transferred firearms and objects into the BMW and commandeered that vehicle and left the site. So it's unusual that anyone who had been in that BMW would have just witnessed that the shooter had murdered people literally on the exit road coming out of the Port Arthur historic site, and yet they didn't drive away, they didn't run away. They had engaged in some form of interaction with the shooter seated in their vehicle. So this, of course, raised a few questions about their purpose and their what they were doing at the toll booth at the time.
So at this stage, Martin's now changed vehicles, but he left his passport and any other objects of importance, do you think, in the Volvo, and that's that passport number? Do you want to touch on why that's all might be important?
Yeah, the vehicle was obviously Martin Bryant's. It was owned by him with the classic surfboard on the top. During that altercation, that shooting, the rear quarter window had been shot out on the Volvo, and in the rear boot of the Volvo was a Daewoo semi-automatic 12-gauge shotgun, some ammunition, and in the glove box of the yellow Volvo was Martin Bryant's passport. This has some bearing later on because at the latter part of the massacre, when the siege was taking place at the Seascape Cottage, the bed and breakfast we mentioned before, Martin Bryant was engaging the police negotiator, Terry McCarthy, on the telephone, a man I've spoken to at great length. But he was not identifying himself as Martin Bryant. He was calling himself Jamie. And the conversation that Terry McCarthy reported it was very odd. He said it was like he was reading from a script and saying very strange things and not acting in a manner that someone you would imagine had just carried out a massacre of that magnitude would. So there was some confusion as to the identity of whoever it was that was holding siege at the Seascape Cottage. Much later on, Terry McCarthy had asked whether he would identify himself, and Jamie had said no, but rattled off his passport number. And he said, I know it so well because I do a lot of travelling. And Martin Bryant did do a lot of international travelling when he inherited his money from Helen Harvey. So lo and behold, they were able to obtain the passport that was in the Volvo and then make the connection that the shooter at the Seascape Cottage was in fact Martin Bryant. His voice was verified by his girlfriend, Petra Wilmot, as being Martin. But it's, I guess, convenient that he rattled off his passport number and there was a passport left behind in the yellow Volvo. This sort of also draws a little parallel with the attack on the 9/11 buildings, where when they collapsed, they crushed most things to powder, and yet miraculously discovered in the ruins of those buildings were the passports of the so-called hijackers.
Yes.
Once again, it's a coincidence, but that in essence, very quickly the determination was made that the shooter at Seascape Cottage, who supposedly had also carried out the massacre at the Port Arthur historic site, was Martin Bryant.
Yeah, before we get to that final siege and showdown at Seascape Cottage, talk about the black van and possible connections to Joe Viles, and do you think anything else that's relevant around the cafe from the footage and photographs that we do have?
Joe Viles, for those of you who don't know, is an author, and a lot of people very much refer to him as being the person you should read when it comes to an investigation into the alternate narrative of the Port Arthur massacre. He is, shall I say, an unusual character, in my opinion, a bit suspect. Joe Viles, I've read his book, Deadly Deception at Port Arthur, takes far too many leaps of conjecture for my liking. There was an unmarked black van that was photographed in the immediate aftermath of the shooting at the Port Arthur historic site. And Joe Viles said, well, that's Mossad or intelligence. I think you can't make those kind of conjectures. There is a much more scientific read on the Port Arthur massacre, which I urge everyone to they can access this on the files, on the Wasp Files, and on the Facebook page, Wasp, the Port Arthur Massacre. It's a book written by a fellow called Noel MacDonald, and it's called The Port Arthur Incident, Prelude to a Royal Commission. Arguably the most scientific read on the Port Arthur Massacre. Yep. Joe Viles has basically come under some question as to his identity. He's often been considered to be an AKA of another interesting character called Ari Ben Menashe, who was once a former Israeli Defense Force soldier and associated with intelligence. And his name sort of crops up. He's a bit of a bad penny, crops up with a lot of interesting international events and incidences that have occurred. Are they the two people? I think that's yet to really be determined. But Joe Viles, if you read his work, seems to be a bit of a case of all show and no tell. He does seem to have a lot of inside knowledge about Port Arthur, but there are a lot of leaps of conjecture, as I've said. So I find him somewhat suspect.
So let's maybe talk about the weapons used at the Broad Arrow. And there was one of your recent videos you touched on how there was plenty of evidence to suggest there was pellets found from shotguns versus the official narrative of only being, a rifle. Do you want to talk about all that?
Yes, there were 3 firearms that were used during the Port Arthur massacre. One is the Colt SP1, or more commonly known as the AR-15. Contrary to popular belief, AR does not stand for assault rifle. It stands for Armalite rifle, which is the manufacturer of the rifle. It's a civilian semi-automatic rifle that shoots a .223 caliber round, which is not a high-powered round per se, but it does have quite a lot of velocity, and it is at close range quite devastating. That particular rifle had a 30-round magazine. It was semi-automatic. Semi-automatic means it's not a machine gun. Fully automatic is when you can hold down the trigger and it will just release all of the rounds, one after the other. Semi-automatic is when you have to manually pull the trigger as many times or as fast as you like to cause the rounds to fire. The other firearm that was used was a much larger and more powerful rifle known as the L1A1, or commonly known in Australia as the SLR, which our military used to carry from the 1960s to the 1970s. It's a semi-automatic high-powered rifle using a .308 caliber round, or 7.62 by 51, which is the military equivalent. And that rifle was also used once the shooting took place outside the cafe. That firearm, when shown to Martin Bryant during his interviews with Inspector Warren and Payne, he denied ever owning. He said, "That's not one of mine. No, never seen that one." Martin Bryant ostensibly owned the Colt SP1 or AR-15. The other firearm that was discovered in the boot of the Volvo was a semi-automatic 10-shot Daewoo shotgun, a very devastating weapon if it was used. However, the ballistics reports that I've read mention no use of that shotgun either inside the Broad Arrow Cafe or in the other shooting locations around the Port Arthur historic site. This flies in the face of some of the witness statements, one of whom, Stephen Howard, had seen a survivor by the name of Dennis Olson, who was seated outside the cafeteria and had clear pallet damage from shotgun wounds. Stephen Howard used to own a shotgun and a .223 caliber rifle, so he would know the difference between shrapnel, which can be caused by rifle rounds shredding when they strike targets, and pellets, which are tiny little round balls, which make a very clear wound configuration on victims. One of the surgeons at the Hobart Hospital, Dr. Wilkinson, also had stated that everywhere we looked, we found pallets. And yet there is no mention of that shotgun being brought into the cafeteria in the gun bag, removed and used. There was exterior tourist video of the shooting that was taking place in the cafeteria, and there was sort of different sounding gunshots, and somebody had exclaimed, "That's a shotgun." So look, it needs to once again to be determined. Whatever forensics were carried out and ballistics on the firearms recovered has never really seen the light of day. I do have the ballistics report, but there's no mention by the ballistics expert Gerard Dutton that the Daewoo shotgun or a shotgun had been used at any point during the shooting, that only the AR-15 and the L1A1 had been used.
And one of those weapons was actually registered to Victorian Police as being handed in. So do you want to talk about that, and maybe Terry Hills, I think it was, and where Martin might have got these weapons from? But I think Terry kept good records. And do you want to talk about that?
I spoke at great length to Dorothy Shearing, who was the wife of Terry Hills, who was the owner of Guns and Ammo in Tasmania at the time, and their son, Matthew Hill. Terry was accused of being the gun dealer that had sold the AR-15 or Colt SP1 to Martin Bryant under the table. There was a lot of mystery surrounding the origins of the firearms that were used at the Port Arthur historic site. There was a Herald Sun investigation that was convened in the latter part of 1996 about the origins of the AR-15 or Colt SP1 itself. It was discovered that that firearm was previously owned by a farmer in Yea, Victoria, by the name of Bill Drysdale. Bill had recognised the AR-15 from a unique gunsmith's mark on the barrel. That was his firearm. He had handed it in 1987 after Premier John Cain's semi-automatic rifle bans after Hoddle Street and Queen Street. He was told that the firearm would be destroyed, but it was not destroyed. It was kept, along with 17 other confiscated or handed in high-powered firearms by the Victorian Special Operations Group Police. They used these firearms as their own until they upgraded to the new Steyr F88 AUGs. Those firearms were then sold to a gun dealer who I know, a very interesting man by the name of Mr. Garnet Featherstone of Granite Arms in Bendigo, Victoria. Garnet had a lot of dealings with, in essence, very high tactical level equipment and used to deal with the police. Apparently, those firearms were sold by the Victorian SOG after being illegally re-registered in the Licensing Regulation Division, in essence given new serial numbers, sold to Garnet Featherstone for around about between $26,000 and $34,000. Garnet then on-sold those high-powered firearms to a collector, and reports I had received was at one collector down at Seascape Cottage, which is very unusual. The son of David and Sally Martin, the owners of Seascape, was Glenn Martin. Supposedly owned firearms of his own, though we don't have a lot of determinations about that. The gun registers of both Terry Hill and Garnet Featherstone have been seized by police and have never seen the light of day. They would comprehensively state where the firearms came from, because they have to be entered into the books, who sold them, who they went to, who they were delivered to, never seen the light of day. So the AR-15 somehow made its way down to Tasmania, purportedly to one collector at Seascape, which may or may not have been Glenn Martin. The elderly couple themselves apparently had a .22 rifle and a couple of old shotguns with the firing pins ground down. A young man had come into the Nabina police station during the shooting and stated there's 43 firearms at Seascape Cottage and, quote, shitloads of ammo. That has never been determined as to the identity of that male. And there were quite a number of firearms that were discovered in the burnt ashes of the Seascape Cottage. So whatever firearms were also discovered, additional firearms at Martin's house in Newtown. There was hidden in a piano, apparently, ammunition, gun belts, gun bags, and an Australian automatic arms, semi-automatic 223 caliber rifle. The origins of these firearms are a mystery. Martin did not have a gun license, so how he managed to procure those, once again, should have been determined in a court of law and was not.
So let's get to the final part of the showdown at Seascape Cottage and some of the anomalies around what happened there and reports of second shooters. We've got police, we've got special operations involved at this point. It goes overnight. There was some testimonies of other cars being shot at by someone that doesn't look anything like Martin Bryant. So talk us through everything that happened there and what your thoughts on that.
What had happened was that once the shooter had commandeered the BMW and exited the Port Arthur historic site from the toll booth, that they had then driven to a service station where a young couple were attempting to exit, and they were cut off by the gold BMW. The shooter had got out at gunpoint and kidnapped the male driver after trying to drag his female partner out of the car. He forced the male at gunpoint into the boot of the BMW, then went back and shot the female partner, Zoe Hall, killing her in the car. The BMW was then driven with Glenn Peers, who was the hostage, to Seascape Cottage. It was driven up onto the grounds of Seascape Cottage, and the shooter had then made their way inside the cottage after firing from the roadside at various vehicles that were passing alongside the road on the way to and from the Port Arthur historic site. So a siege then was undertaken at this bed and breakfast cottage, the Seascape Cottage. The two first police officers that arrived on the scene, Gary Whittle and Paul Hyland, were immediately fired upon, and that they had witnessed that the BMW had been set alight and there was smoke pouring from the vehicle. They pulled back to a safe location. They were soon joined by Constable Pat Allen. He was pinned down with very accurate fire from the Seascape Cottage, taking cover behind his cruiser. and then later on in a ditch with Gary Whittle. And they were spent pretty much the most of the evening pinned down under heavy fire from Seascape Cottage. Special Operations Group police converged on the site and contained a cordon around the cottage. It was in a rural sort of bush environment, and the cottage itself fronted onto the bay. And the siege took place into the evening. There were initially reports of multiple shooters, shots coming from different locations within the property. At one point, a helicopter was fired upon, and a blonde-haired individual was witnessed on the roof of the guest house. And the Special Operations Group snipers were had that person in their sight. They asked for permission to engage, and the directive came back: do not engage. This has to happen. There were times when the snipers, and their names, one of them was reported as Sniper Sierra, could see a silhouetted figure through the flywire screen in the cottage, and once again was calling for the right to engage that target, but was told do not engage. There was some concern that there were hostages inside the Seascape Cottage. So as reported before, a phone conversation was set up with the police negotiator Terry McCarthy and the shooter inside the cottage. This person, calling themselves Jamie, was having an odd conversation. One of the strange anomalies, one of the most disturbing ones really, was that a recording exists, which is available, where Jamie is talking about making a cup of tea and frying up some egg and bacon for the hostages. And while he's doing so, quite amiably, you can clearly hear gunshots in the background. These were explained away by the police and recorded in the transcript as being coughs. There were some 20 coughs, but these were later independently verified to be shots from an SKS semi-automatic 223 rifle. Yeah. Someone was shooting while Martin was on the phone to Terry McCarthy, talking about making cups of tea and sandwiches for the hostages. So there was a lot of indications that lights were turning off and on in different buildings, that there was more than one person there at least. At some point, nightfall fell, and the shooter in the cottage had some form of line of sight or night division device attached to a firearm, because during the conversation with Terry McCarthy, he said, what I've just found out, man, is that one of your boys is on the northeast corner. And I can see him through this scope. It's a laser scope. Do you want to tell him to move back? And Terry McCarthy replied, yes, we don't want anyone hurt. So the strange contradiction is that this shooter, who had apparently killed 35 men, women, and children with impunity at the Port Arthur historic site, actually warned the police officers back. No police officers were killed during that siege. However, they were pinned down and shot quite accurately at by the shooter in the cottage. Yeah. The shooting took place into the evening, and the conversation died at some point. And the very next morning, the cottage caught alight, or by reports was set on fire. At one point, an individual dressed in black ran out with a handgun and fired into the immediate area before running back into the building, which was on fire. Sometime later, Martin Bryant ran out of the Seascape Cottage wearing different coloured clothing on fire, and he stripped off that clothing and was arrested by the converging Special Operations Group police, quote, grinning and out with the fairies. So he was arrested at the Seascape Cottage, and that places him at, in essence, the latter part of the siege. He was then transported to the Hobart Hospital to be treated for burns, and that's when the next morning the massacre had, in essence, ended.
Yeah. As you say, some people speculated he may have been, drugged with a sedative, and that's why he appeared out with the fairies, and maybe he was meant to pass away in that fire, and he it woke him up when he came out burning, with his clothes burning. But I wanted to touch on the phone call that happened at 3:08, and you touched on the snipers being told to stand down, but I believe two AFP officers resigned as well with something that all happened there with that phone call and everything in
There was a
mid-afternoon.
report that, two Australian federal police officers had resigned in disgust once that directive went out over the radio, which would have been heard by the SES and all the other aspects of the police. It was considered to be unusual that there was no directive to engage the shooter or to, in essence, assault the property, ostensibly because they were concerned about hostages, I imagine. But as we've seen with some of the, the other sieges that took place, like the Lint Cafe siege in Sydney, there was a standoff before the Special Operations Group went in force. However, I believe the sniper that also had man Monis in his sights and was also denied the ability to engage was very angry at that and sued the police because he felt that he could have neutralised that threat very early on prior to the assault that took place on that cafe where people, innocent victims were then killed. So, look, whether or not there is a failure in command or just the procedure whereby police are instructed to engage threats, there was certainly opportunity for police to be able to neutralise the threat at Seascape Cottage, and yet they were given the directive to stand down. So I guess the rest is history. There were some unusual aspects where when Martin Bryant was being transported in the ambulance away from the Seascape Cottage because he was burnt, a witness who was one of the ambulance officers was basically gave a statement that Martin had said, "What's this all about?" And he said, "Oh, I preserve life, unlike you." And Martin had replied, "Where's Petra?" And the ambulance officer said, "Was she with you?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "In the fire?" And he said, "Yes, we're never apart." There were reports by the two first police officers that arrived at Seascape Cottage, both of whom tendered witness statements that they saw a naked, dark-haired person running between the guest house and the cottage. One of them stated that the person was female. Sally Martin was an elderly lady with grey hair, ostensibly, supposedly murdered earlier that morning. The identity of the naked person running between the buildings was never really determined in a court of law. Petra had supposedly departed with Martin in the morning and then gone home to her parents. But there's just a lot of odd occurrences that have never really been provided sufficient answer to.
Now, all the media headlines reported 33 dead, and we know that that 33 number has a lot of significance in Freemasonry and all that type of thing as well. But the official toll was actually higher than that in the end. But the newspaper headline was 33.
Look, I don't hold too much faith in that notion that the event and the numbers were specific to the Freemasonry. I understand that 33 is a very significant number amongst achievements that are acquired by Freemasons in regards to that secretive institution. As I said, I'm more of a scientific mind. There were 35 people that were killed and 23 injured. I think one of the biggest things about the media, which people should be outraged at, was that the very next day, somebody had broken into Martin's house at excuse me, at 30 Clare Street, Newtown, and stolen a photograph of Martin, and that photograph was printed the very next morning in all of the major newspapers with headlines like "This is the man" and "The face of a killer." Literally the morning after the siege. Now, he had not even been charged. That is against the law. That had prejudiced any chance of a fair trial. And the two witnesses that you stated out of the 200 who comprehensively identified Martin Bryant as the shooter, both went on record to say, well, we saw his photograph in the paper and we may have been influenced by that photograph.
Yeah.
the media was slapped across the wrist for that. They also doctored the image of Martin Bryant. So I spoke to a journalist who was outraged at the fact that they had doctored, the Australian newspaper had doctored an image of Martin Bryant where they had raised his eyebrows up to give him a crazed look and printed that as an image of Martin Bryant. When questioned about that by the ABC's Media Watch, literally in a phone conversation, they said it was a technical glitch. But it was some nefarious machinations of the press on the day to demonise Martin Bryant and certainly to determine his guilt before the man had even been charged. Absolutely. So there was no chance we were ever going to have a trial on that basis alone.
Yeah, and then I guess the rest is history. John Howard ordering the cafe to be, burnt down and no investigation, all that type of thing. I know you've got to go soon, Paul, but I guess the last anomaly was the Black Hawk helicopter crash with 19 soldiers dying in Townsville, and there's been some speculation about that. Some of those people may or may not have been involved, and what's your thoughts on that?
Once again, the connection's very spurious. In essence, there was a Black Hawk helicopter crash where 17 Special Operations Group, SASR, Special Air Service soldiers, very highly trained commandos, were tragically killed. There was, in essence, some accusations that the shooter who had gone into the Port Arthur historic site, in essence, who had acquired Martin's yellow Volvo and his firearms and impersonated him, was highly trained SASR soldier and most likely a psychopath. And that then, in order to quieten the or to silence the evidence in relation to that there was a helicopter crash where these people were killed. There was one of those soldiers who had been recognised. He was driving, escorting in the front seat of the ambulance that was transporting Martin Bryant to the hospital, a very intense-looking man who was recognised and identified as being Captain Calvin Hales of the Special Air Service. He was killed in the Black Hawk helicopter crash. The ADF were able to provide support mechanisms in relation to events that take place around Australia, but they're not allowed to be employed in any combat capacity on Australian soil against Australian citizens. So there were certainly helicopter pilots and support networks from the ADF that were in place on the day. Also, strangely enough, when Martin was talking to Terry McCarthy, he was mentioning that he was in the Seascape cottage with Rick, that he knew Rick very well, that he knew Rick's wife, and at one point even mentioned that Rick's wife was high up in intelligence. Rick has often widely been attributed to being Special Operations Group Michael Charles Dyson, who has strenuously denied those accusations. There was also signalman Henrik Rick Peters, who was also killed in the Townsville helicopter crash. The connection is dubious. The mention of Rick as being an associate of the shooter in Seascape raises some questions about who would have been in that cottage. But all of this should have been determined in a court of law and an inquest, and we never had one.
Yeah. And as you say, there's been some speculation that the person may have been wearing a wig or also had longer hair than Martin Bryant to possibly cover up, an earpiece or earbuds from the loud noises from shooting and that type of thing as well.
Look, to finish off, there's so much to cover. I'm not here to determine guilt or innocence. I do strongly believe that there is a lot more going on to the story of Port Arthur than the official narrative. I simply am here to ask questions and to encourage people to do your research. You don't have to take my word for it, but do your research. I've researched comprehensively and still do to this day, 9 years later. The whole point is we should be able to ask questions. I despise the term conspiracy theorist and tinfoil hat wearer. It's a derogatory term designed to shut down debate, discussion, and questioning. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. And that's what I'm here to do, and to hopefully educate people on what they don't know about the Port Arthur massacre. It's been a very grim and torturous journey. I've had multiple death threats. I've been warned off. This is not a, I'm not here for popularity or fame, or I could care less about that. What I want is for us to stand up and say, if something's not right, we have the right to ask questions and to be provided with the information that's been locked down till 2091.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of those survivors and the families of the victims are the ones calling for these inquiries and justice and that. So, guys, we will wrap it up there. Paul, keep up the amazing work you're doing. I'll put the links down below to follow Paul on all his socials, and be sure to check out all the deep dive episodes he's done. But keep up the good work, mate.
I will. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.